Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's Art Chat with Linda Fisler and her guest, Carolyn Anderson. My name is Sarah Alspaugh. I am the Online Education Manager here in the Fine Art Department at F&W. I want to thank everyone for joining us today and just let you know that there is a questions section on your GoToWebinar control panel, and it is there where you can type in questions for Linda and Carolyn, and we will save some time at the end for a little Q&A session. So I'll go ahead and pass this over to you, Linda. Thanks for doing this today.
Oh, thank you for arranging everything that you arranged for us, Sarah. You're great at that, and I do appreciate all the work you put in towards that. So thank you so much.
Sure thing.
And also wanted to say hello to all of our listeners out there. This is seems to be a very popular chat. So hello to everyone out there, and thank you for taking time out of your day on a probably very busy Friday to come in and listen to Carolyn and I talk about the myths and realities of creating a painting. And Carolyn, I want to bring you into the conversation and say hello. How are things in Montana?
Things are just fine in Montana, and it's good to be back on the show with you, so thank you for having me.
Oh, yes, I enjoy talking with you and hearing your insights and observations. And I know through the week I've been getting a lot of emails and Facebook posts about how excited everybody was that you were going to be on the show again, and also a lot of comments about our last show, which was we talked about mastering edges, and I know we're going to touch a little bit on that today too, because I think when we talk about myths and realities and seeing and things like that, edges naturally play into that. But let's before we get into a more in-depth type of conversation, let's start out and then dig a little bit deeper, start up a little higher. So when you're teaching, we've encountered many myths and maybe confusion by some that some myths are actually rules or reality. There are times when we also break the rules. In your experience as an artist and a teacher, can you tell us some of the more common myths that you've come across and your perception on how these myths might seem to become reality?
Absolutely. I'm going to start with the biggie, because the big one here covers a lot of the other stuff that you're talking about, and that is the myth that somehow we seem to think there's a list of rules to follow when we paint. And unfortunately, well, I can understand why that one's appealing, because it's just, it's just kind of like, well, gee, tell me how to do this, and by golly, I can learn to do it. But
right.
I think what happens here is that creativity and possibilities of what we can create are lost in the quest to follow the rules. And we need to understand that a lot of these so-called rules most of them are suggestions. So no absolute rule. I usually tell my students to question whether or not it's actually written in stone and follow accordingly. But there are a few of them that are actually factual in the whole rule thing. Such as warmer light, cooler shadows, cooler light, warmer shadows. That's based on the science of color. The idea of working from dark to light is equally valid, simply because most people paint on a canvas that's either light to middle value. It makes perfect sense that you would start out with something darker. But other than that, there's just a lot of stuff out there that are either individual artists' way of working, or perhaps suggestions, like some things just work better. That's all there is to it. So I think the first point to get across is that, really, it's about creativity. Some of this obviously is craft, but a lot of the stuff that's put out there as some kind of rule is actually not. So one thing that I see that trips people up all the time is the so-called rule never to put anything in the middle of the canvas. And I see students all the time flail around trying to get a reasonable composition when faced with, let's say, a model who they're right in front of, and the model's looking straight forward. And they'll go to great lengths to try and get that composition off balance by moving the model on their canvas over to some kind of strange location on the board. So the thing to take across here is that we basically do not want to create equal balance. So unequal balance, more interesting, more dynamic. So when creating something, we're dealing with basically value shapes and color. That's what's determining our balance, not the object itself. So, you know, I know this one trips a lot of people up, and hopefully we can forestall any major, you know, errors going on when people sit down in front of their painting. But I like to tell people, especially when it comes to portraits, there's probably far more portraits painted out there with the subject actually in the middle, good paintings, historical paintings, than there are with someone kittywampus on the canvas. Now, if the model's looking off towards the side or something like that, you have a little bit more leeway. But that's one instance that I see where one of the so-called rules, which is basically a suggestion, and it's all about balance, gets twisted around, and then we focus on a minor part of the suggestion. So another one, let's go with painting what you see. Now, that's another one with the kernel of truth, but the problem here is with the scene. This is basically a scene problem that often turns into a painting problem. So we have to accept that we do not see everything in front of us. Our brains process the information on a need-to-know basis. So we don't necessarily quantify all the values and the colors, and we certainly don't quantify and assess the types of edges that are in our visual field. So sometimes that information, whether it's value or color or even objects, needs to be modified. So, you know, the idea behind paint what you see is a good one, but you need to kind of take it with a grain of salt. So if you recognize that we don't necessarily see everything, that means we need to look a little bit more and decide, you know, is there more here to see? Because once you kind of shut your brain off to that aspect of, boy, everything that I need to know is right in front of me, then you're asking for problems. So sometimes we need to add more information, sometimes we need to delete information, and sometimes we just have to modify information. I think what it comes down to is that ultimately whether or not your painting looks right to you is what's most important, not that you have copied all the information in front of you. So on those two, I think that, you know, that covers a whole bunch of stuff. There's another one here that I think is really important, and that's ties in with this, the paint what you see, and we think what we see is truth. And this is just another aspect of the seeing problem. The reality is we are wired to make sense of the world, and our brains will go to great lengths to reconcile discrepancies in our perception. So when we see colors perhaps that don't quite fit, I like to say, let's say a purple light on a red apple. Ordinarily what's going to happen here is that your brain's just going to discard some of that information. So you still see a red apple. You just absolutely won't see it all. Artists, on the other hand, have a little step up on that ladder. And as artists, we know that that's an object right there for a painting. But you always need to be aware that there can be information there that you absolutely are not seeing. So when we accept what's in front of us without questioning it, we kind of shut that door to seeing more information. That's that whole knowing thing. You know, what we know gets in the way of the seeing. So unless we accept there can be more information, we do not necessarily look for more information, and then we just don't see it. So we can easily miss a lot of the stuff that's out there that makes an interesting painting. So, you know, I think on the big scheme, they kind of, that first one, the list of the rules thing, covers a whole bunch of stuff. The other two gets into the seeing part, which is basically what we're doing when we paint. So ultimately, we just need to remember that our verbal language, which actually comprises how we see the world around us, is object dependent. Okay, it's all about the thing, right? Visual language, however, is relationship dependent. So realist painting may depend on the object, but how a painting is constructed is completely dependent on relationships. I think that covers a whole bunch of stuff right there.
Oh yeah. Yeah. So well, the last thing you said about relationships. You know, we're talking color relationships, and not only just color relationships, but how objects in the scene relate to one another. Just can we dig a little bit deeper about that? I just listed two. I'm sure with your experience, you know a lot more.
Well, here's something that we often overlook, and our brains actually evaluate the visual information based on as compared to. Things don't exist just as little individual pieces. So the quality of the light obviously has a lot to do with it. Changes, your distance from something. I mean, there's all kinds of information going on here, visual information. So the most basic way that the brain evaluates that information is as compared to. That's the biggie. And once we kind of lose that sense of the as compared to, we lose the relationship. And it really does. I mean, I think that one idea that verbal language, what we name the thing, an apple is an apple kind of information, is object dependent. A painting, however, depends on all those pieces of information. So the apple doesn't just exist as an outline. It has dimension, so it has a variety of edge. It has color, but that color has a lot to do with the color of everything that you're seeing in the light that's lighting that apple. So that's all about relationships. So visual language, relationship dependent; verbal language, object dependent. I think if I had suggestions for people, I would say that if people want more information about some of this, I would suggest Vision and Art: The Biology of Seeing by Margaret Livingstone. And we might have mentioned that in our last talk, I'm not sure. But the other thing, National Geographic has been running a really interesting show called Brain Games, exploring how the brain assesses information. They have some on vision and some on motion and things like that. So those two, whether you want to read or whether you just want to look at something on a screen, I think can be really valuable for any artist.
Yeah, we had talked a little bit when I asked you to be on the show about the National Geographic show. I still have not been able to find it, but I know
I think it's running
it's out
right
there
now,
because
so.
I know. Is it okay? Great. So that's it was Brain Games. Is that correct?
Brain Games.
Yeah.
And of course,
and that got.
Go ahead.
Go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to
You go
say
ahead.
that when the show's running, they always have previous shows on, so you aren't just getting the current show, you're getting all the others that went before. So it's really easy. I'll flip through when I see it, and I'll set it to record for particular shows that I might be interested in. They had a
Right,
good one
yeah,
just a while back on color. That was interesting. And time, which is something more of us as artists should pay attention to.
Say more about that.
About time. And well, we kind of often
why an artist
should pay attention to time. Yeah, isn't that interesting?
Yes.
Vision is dependent on a multitude of things. It's not just what's in front of our eyes. At the same time, we can be associating what we're seeing with what we're hearing. We can recognize maybe not only the passage of time, and I mean there's another point to be made about time and painting, but it can be an aspect of the painting, especially if you are painting something that is changing or will change soon. It's just something that, here again, what we're seeing is not fixed in time. It's a part of the passage of time.
Right. So how light moves is one example of that.
Exactly.
Yeah. And I guess with the brain game thing, I was going to get into a conversation a little bit about both of us teach, and I actually want to actually come to one of your workshops one of these days. So you may actually meet me in person, Carolyn.
That would be great.
Anyway, yeah. Well, I know we met back on weekend with the masters, but I mean,
right, yeah.
for more than about 10 minutes.
Yeah, we didn't get to talk art.
So anyway, no, we really didn't. But the thing that I always find interesting is how some of my students tend to overlook things until the instructor points it out to them. Like I was standing there looking out the window with my students the other day, and I said, "Wow, look at that purple light on the tree. Shadow there. Look how it's getting cast purple." And I'm looking around to figure out why the color, and they're all looking at me like I was some alien from Mars and
Exactly.
saying that light isn't purple, you know. And I said, no, no, no. I said, I look away from it, then look back. And we did a
Exactly.
real exercise, you know, and trying to get them to not listen to their brains say that tree trunks are brown.
Right.
Or gray, or what ever color that anybody ever said they were, you know. And I keep saying, and I said, and then I challenged them. I said, you tell me what other colors you see, because I may not be seeing what you're seeing, because we certainly see differently, each of us. So any advice on how we can expand our mind to, or I guess I should say, expand our eyes to see and not listen to our brain?
First of all, accept that what you see is not the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. That is a biggie, because knowledge is power on this one. And once you pointed out that color to your students and allowed them to make a comparison and perhaps see that color, that added to their wealth of information. Now they know that when they look out there, not perhaps to accept what's right in front of them, to keep looking, because this is an area where the brain will filter out the information. And you have to understand that visual information occupies a very large part of what our brain is processing at all times. So in order to, let's say, conserve energy and space, we kind of default to what we know. You know, tree trunks are brown. Shadows are gray, you know, whatever it may be. And that's kind of how we see. I know that's a difficult one for people to accept, but it's the truth. And if they, here again, they might want to go to watch some of those shows on National Geographic, and I kind of call it neuroscience light, but it's, you know, it's an interesting lead-in to understanding what's going on when we look at things. So, you know, I've run into the same thing. You know, you might be looking out. I can remember vividly standing in my front yard one time with a couple other people and exclaiming over the color of the shadows. I mean, they were just an amazing turquoise blue, and the other two people looked at me and like I was nuts. And then they looked back, and both of them said almost at the same time, "Well, we always thought shadows were just gray." See, that's the difference. You have to learn to look, and the easiest way to do that is knowledge is power. Accept that what's out there is not necessarily all the information, that if you keep looking, your brain will see it. And then the best way to do that is to compare.
Right.
So compare opposites, like lightest and darkest, or warmest and coolest. Do that first, and then look back to the information you're trying to identify.
Right, and it was really helpful at one workshop that we were at, where someone actually had like gels that they could put in front of the light, and certain colors set up, and then they would put a gel in, and how that particular color of light hit on, let's say, an orange object, or you know, a blue object, or whatever. You know, it was interesting just to sit there, let yourself be open to that. So experiment around a little bit with light, if you can.
Yeah.
You know,
and colored
to see how
light
that
is a good way
works,
to
and
do it.
Just observe.
And
yeah,
you know,
just
setting up a still life.
Observing. You know, it's just
setting up a still life and using some colored lights on it, along with, you know, perhaps a standard light. So in other words, you're enhancing maybe the shadow area or something like that. Can be a lot of fun.
Yeah, yeah. So, okay, so let's take seeing in a little bit further and talk about, as we're looking at a scene, and this actually will also start taking us into things like photo reference and our reference material, whether it's live or not, whether it's plein air studies or anything like that. But how do we take what we see, and there's a beautiful example. I don't know if you're in front of your computer or not, Carolyn, but one of your paintings is up. It's the lady with the red, looks like a skirt with a white top, and she has her head in her hand. And, you know, so let's talk a little bit about techniques, edges, colors, values, you know, how we see and how that affects what we're trying to capture. How do we use it in the creation process? Kind of make a connection from seeing to actually making it the visual language, if you will.
Well, first of all, and I won't say this always works, but first of all, what I like to do is to find some kind of contrasting visual information. And of course, there you've got a lot of things you're dealing with. Value is the most obvious, but then shape is another one that can, you know, add to your painting, let's say. So if I have a subject that I know in my mind could go south and just kind of resort to just another portrait, let's say. You know, I kind of have this thing about, you know, I paint a lot of people, but I don't want just a portrait. You know, portraits can have their value, obviously, but that's not exactly what I do. So I try to find the visual information that speaks as strongly or more strongly than what it is that I'm seeing. So in this case, I think the one you're looking at, I mean, we have the color we're dealing with, we have some contrast, and we have the whole shape thing, you know, the kind of large mass of that skirt at the bottom of the painting kind of leading up, you know, kind of a almost basic triangular composition. So that to me is like the most important thing, is if you can find the information that takes it from being literal or object oriented and twist it over to seeing relationships of visual information. So whether it's shape, you know, line, shape, value, color. And then of course we can throw edges into the mix of all those. And the edge thing kind of has a lot to do with the fact that we're painting 3 dimensions on a 2-dimensional surface. So we need to keep in mind that sometimes we need to perhaps exaggerate some of that information, because what we're looking at is real, you know, 3 dimensions. Well, when we go to put it on a canvas, we're squashing it down into 2 dimensions. So some of that information kind of either needs to be pushed or discarded or something to get the illusion of what it is that you're seeing and what's important. And in the case of that painting, you know, I don't want just a woman, you know, there with a skirt and a blouse and, you know, leaning on her hand. No, I want visual information that I find interesting.
And the visual information leads us to start that emotional connection.
I think so. The artist connection.
Yeah.
You know, the artist connection.
Because
take the painting somewhere else. Don't accept it for just what it is. Find something else. And for me, it's trying to find visual information I find interesting. Because if I don't make that connection, then I'll struggle with the painting.
Right. We're looking at the one now where the mother is holding the baby and her cheek, or she's giving the baby a kiss. She's got like a pink dress on, and the baby's doesn't look like he's got anything on, actually. But that diaper, whole, the minute it came up, well, yeah, hopefully. But anyway, you know, that whole, as soon as that came up, there was the first thing where my eyes went were where the mother is kissing the child. That. And if I look at that, that's not absolute center, but it's, you know, centered left to right, if you will. I mean, that's, to me, is that where you want your focus to go, directly to that, that particular area?
Well, that's a natural place where the focus is going to go. So then the key to keep that painting from being too trite or too sweet, you know, which to me is like default mechanism, and I would ask myself, well, can't you find something else to say about this? Then you're going to notice on that one that the information, you know, when you first glance at that painting, it takes a minute for your eyes to almost focus. Did you have that? Yeah. It's, so there's a lot of information in there that one could say is not resolved, okay? It's not like all connected. It's what I call fractured information. But because we will have a natural tendency, obviously, to go to people's faces, then that somewhat anchors it, and that alone balances all that abstract information that is almost but not quite fallen apart. So that's the visual part of it that I find interesting.
Yeah. Do you find that some of us, let's just put it that way, artists are I guess too, I don't want to say dependent, but we're just not letting the creative process develop. In other words, we're being too controlling, not getting ourselves out of the way. I mean,
We all
you
do
know,
that.
it's
Yeah,
like,
that's a given.
okay.
And no,
Yeah.
we all do that. And here's the reason why. It's darn scary to in other words, go somewhere you haven't been before. So control for a lot of us comes from adding information or noodling information or tightening up on information. In other words, putting everything in there. You know, let's just draw this all out and then color it in, and by golly, I'm in control. And that's not necessarily a bad way to work. But the problem with that approach is that you shut the door to all the possibilities of where this painting could have gone. You know, it's just slam the door. It's like, this is going to be a picture. You know, it's never going to become a painting.
Yeah, it's really interesting because the more I look at your paintings, like at one point, she has her two hands on the child, the lower hand. The upper hand, at first, when I first glanced at it, I thought that was actually could be the baby's stomach, and now I just noticed that's her second hand, that's her other hand, and I'm like, wow. So it's like this discovery process that I'm going through looking at this that I probably would have defined with harder edges, and it has to be in focus, and all of that. But I think that maybe by doing that, I lose a lot of, the viewer doesn't stay there longer. They just kind of, everything's in focus, everything looks great, I'm walking off,
Yeah, basically what it comes down to is that, here again, if you accept that there are possibilities of how we are seeing visual information, and there's different pieces of that information that can be more important than the object. And see, that's what in a painting like that, that's what I like about it, is because there's a fair amount of information that for definition is fairly minimal, but you can still see what it is. I mean, if you were to blow that up and look at the pieces, but and you reduce it down a little bit, oh yeah, I see it now. So it's all information based on visual language: line, shape, value, color.
Right. Yeah, that's gorgeous. I love that one. So
thank you.
Okay, so let's talk a little bit about photo reference and how we should use them. I know that it's hard to capture something that is in movement when you're painting it, like your horses, cats that move. Nothing really stands still. So, I know folks that use photo reference. I use photo reference. I use plein air studies, whatever. But how should we use those?
Carefully. Carefully. But here's the thing about photos. Well, first of all, let me say that for many, many years in my workshops, I always just taught from using the model. That was it. Okay. And then several years ago, I decided to start adding in just a short session on working from a photo. And what I found that was kind of number one, I find that visually it changes it up from painting from the model, during the week. So that helps. We get to pick different subject matter and explore different things. But what I found that was interesting was that people who had never painted from a photo, let's say, who had only painted strictly from life, had fun with it. And they had fun with it because they were able to see the information slightly differently. So with that in mind, you can accept that it's just I like to say that direct observation requires a certain learning curve to deal with that information. Working from any kind of photos is another type of learning curve. There's a different type of information. But the thing about, let's say, movement, obviously there are some advantages. Now, you could paint, if you're well-versed in anatomy and drawing horses, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, you could paint horses from life. Very few people can do that. But, Ned Jacob is one. But what you are using then is information that you have learned more than the information that is necessarily in front of you. You're trying to combine the two. But there's a lot of learned information. And it's also dependent on how good a visual memory someone has. And not all of us have excellent visual memories. Some people do. They can recall everything. But, you know, most of us, I say, nah, probably not, you know. So if you take something, let's say that's moving or on the verge of moving, and you're working from photos, you want to be able to capture that sense of the movement. Otherwise, what's the point of doing it, right? So you need that, what I say is the point where either it's moving or it becomes something else, or you feel like it's on the verge of moving. You know, it's not fixed in time. Bring back that whole time factor in there. And so then what do? I mean, you can just blur stuff. You go, oh yeah, it's moving. It's blurry. But if you want to, you need to take it to another place. Let's put it that way, because you can't just, you know, this isn't like a film on your canvas where it is moving. You know, no matter what you do, as you paint it, you're going to fix it in time. So you need to capture that sense that it is going to change. And then you're just dealing with visual information to try and get that sense of it. You know, that kind of little twinge of it's not exactly fixed. And you know what? A lot of that has to do with edges. Because that's where we start to lose definition. Now, you can resort to just, let's say, a big fan brush, you know, blur the edges, but it doesn't quite capture it. So I found that paying attention to the quality of the edge makes a huge bit of difference. And then how much information do I put in? Because here again, too much information is going to kill that subject just as more quickly than you can imagine, because it's going to stop the eye from that sense of movement.
Yeah, it's also it's some of this as simple as realizing that when you shift your vision to another part of the scene that you're painting, that area becomes focused, where everything on the peripheral of our vision is not focused.
Yeah, that's pretty much it. You know, we need to control how we are looking at something when we are painting it. Just whether it's direct observation or using a photograph. You need to realize that as your eye moves around a subject, for example, you know, a live subject, that you have focus, you know, everything behind it not in focus. You move your eyes, you have focus, everything. So that's where you know, you need to say, well, okay, what's most important here? You concentrate on that and then let the other information evolve. But, you know, it's the same thing with the photograph. So I know a lot of people say that all photographs have hard edges, and that's absolutely not true. In fact, on occasion, I have taken some photographs in a PowerPoint, you know, where you're getting them in large size, and then gone through with the students and pointed out the variety of edge. You know, it's all there in photograph, believe me. It's just that we have this, here's the knowing part, we have this in our head that photographs are all hard-edged. So we just don't see the fact that there's a variety of edge. You don't look for it, you don't see it. It's as simple as that. Yeah,
sounds simple, but how come everything that I paint's in focus? I'm sorry,
well, you know,
I know why after talking with you.
here's a couple things that can help. Obviously, the first one is use a bigger brush. You know, I mean, that can help a lot of people, believe it or not. And make sure that you regularly get back away from your painting. You want to change up, because when we look at things naturally, we don't stare at something for, you know, however long. We don't just stare at one thing, right? We're constantly moving around. You want to do the same thing with your painting. It can make a difference. So that's where you get the difference between painting direct observation and painting a photo. So direct observation, you have some of that natural sense of seeing something living, breathing, changing, whatever, okay? A photo, it's fixed, so you've got to incorporate that information. Here again, this is where the knowing part kind of helps. And so you need to change up how you're doing that. So the larger brushes can help getting away from your painting, changing how you see it. And you always want to put your information in the context of the whole. So you don't want to focus for too long on any one small area of a painting. Sometimes we have to do that because we're trying to figure out what the heck it is that we're seeing. You know, when I say the noodle it to death approach. And I've done that. You know, you're trying to get information, let's say, on a hand. And it's like, can't get it. So sometimes you might have to go in there and just anatomically, if you will, noodle the hand. And then scrape it down and do it again. You know? Then you kind of get an understanding of what's going on with that information. And then hopefully you can distill enough of the information that you need. You do not need everything. TMI, too much information. The biggest problem we all make. Or not, or information without enough focus. You know, in other words, we just put a bunch of information in and hope to heck something jumps out at us.
Yeah, it's interesting because I paint a lot with palette knives, and I am very aware of hard edges because it's very easy to make hard edges with palette knives, and that's one of the things that, you know, I'm constantly, I'll go back, put something in, I'll scrape it off, I'll, you know, mush things together, if you will, real technical term there, but just so that I don't have so many hard edges that keep stopping the eye, because I don't want that to happen. You know, the softness of your paintings with the blurring, if you will, of things, it's just, you know, it's just great eye candy. I mean, it just keeps you looking, and the color and things. So
one of the secrets, one of the tricks, okay,
secret's
is
not a rule.
to try not to create an edge to begin with. Okay, so when you start a painting, you want to, obviously you want to tell people you can't throw everything on that canvas all at once. So some of that information you need to get down, you know. Some of the information, however, you need to start quantifying it and evaluating it, even if you aren't painting it. So when you're making a mark, you're asking yourself, you know, for example, what's the value? What's the color temperature? And to get that information, you need to compare it to other areas to get it accurately. And then you also, what's the shape? That's a good one. And then you also need to ask yourself, is there an edge? And if there is an edge, what kind of edge is it? If there isn't an edge, or the edge is fairly indistinct, ask yourself, why? What's creating that form? And a lot of edge information comes from the areas outside the object, okay? It's a value coming up to something. So if you put two values next to each other that are the same, you're going to lose your edge. You don't have to, you know, smudge all that stuff. So the thing is, if you don't create the edge to begin with, that's a step in the right direction. Because once you create edges everywhere, it's really, really tough to get the sense of each of those pieces connecting. You need to make the connection about the pieces, you know, where they're going and if they're distinct or not distinct or whatever, instead of creating all the pieces and then trying to blur everything up. So that's a thought process. You know, the whole thinking part.
Right.
Is there an edge? What kind of an edge? What creates this form? So.
Yeah, that's part of the critical thinking skills, which we're going to get into in a second. But I just want to remind our audience, as you have questions, if you will type those in, Sarah will collect those for us. And we're about, you know, we're getting close to the point where we're going to be able to allow you to ask Carolyn some questions via Sarah. So I want to encourage you to start typing and get those questions in. And let's get back to Carolyn, if we can, a little bit about critical thinking skills. And I want to introduce it in a way that carries on the conversation that we were just in. You know, we started talking about edges and we were talking about values and, you know, putting those values next to another. Does it create an edge? Or is it part of the same value in this shape, but it's a color shift, etc.? Does all of that planning, to me, that's part of the critical thinking that should go on when we start working on the foundation of the painting. Is that true?
Well, definitely. You need to identify some of that information as soon as possible. However, then, you know, if we talk about the seeing part of it, I guarantee you that the more you look at something, the more information you're going to see. Now, the reason why I think it was the myth about, you know, just painting what you see, that one, this is where that one kind of enters in, because that can be valuable to a degree, because when you say just paint what you see, that's basically saying just get your first impression. Don't noodle it to death. Don't overthink it. Don't, you know, and that can have value. You know, we all know the value of quick studies, and sometimes how they can look so fresh, and, you know, because we just don't, you know, overthink it. So that alone has value. But here's the thing. If you want to explore your subject more in depth, you need to look a little bit more. And then the more you look, the more you see. And unfortunately, what happens is a lot of times people will just keep adding information. And then pretty soon we just have a painting with a whole bunch of information, and nothing is special, you know. It's just a painting with a bunch of information. So that critical thinking has to go on during the whole painting. You know, and part of it depends on your process. Mine, I'm kind of, I like to be in the position where, you know, with synergy, if you will, when you're doing the paint. It doesn't always work that way. But every time I put a mark down on that canvas, I want to be evaluating how that influences everything else that I have. Or if something else needs to change because of the mark that I just made. So everything has a relationship to everything else. Ideally, that's, you know, that's where I like to be with a painting. So what you're doing, it's that kind of left brain, right brain thing. So you've got creative you and thinking you. And this is where painting becomes a problem. Because we know if we overthink while we're painting, we have a tendency to kind of mush things all together, and nothing's really that interesting or that outstanding or that surprising. It's just a picture, okay? So the key here is to try and find a rhythm of the paint, think, paint, think. So you want to avoid making too many brush strokes at one time without evaluating what the heck it is doing to your painting. And that gets back to that whole idea of filling in, and I see that a lot with people, where we draw something and we fill it in. So now, let's say I have a student who's just worked on a head, you know, head and shoulders or whatever, and now, by golly, they're going to fill in the background. Well, can you see where that kind of creates a problem? If that part of your canvas was never part of your painting to begin with, how much sense would it make to just say, okay, I finished this part of the canvas, now I'm going to paint the rest of the canvas, unless you had some kind of really good plan to begin with. And a lot of times people don't. It's just like, oh, no, now what do I do with this? See? Somewhere along the line you need to be thinking ahead, you know, that whole thinking part. Okay, I kind of default to where am I going to lose an edge and where am I going to find an edge, because that helps dictate how your values transition. So critical thinking, you know, I think, you know, we need to, you know, first thing, and this works for either photographs or direct observation, doesn't make any difference. Identify and quantify your light source. Where is it coming from, and is it warmer and cooler? So these are like straightforward steps. Decide what's most important to you. That's fairly, you know, that's a biggie. And then simplify your approach. So you want to try and create a pattern with your three values, light, middle, dark. You know, and as you add information, that's going to modify some, but you know, that kind of keeps everything simple. So in other words, what we're doing is organizing information in as simple a way as possible to allow us to control that whole process of painting, thinking, painting, thinking, you know. And then you always want to compare, and you want to make sure that you do not resort to what I call the just follow whatever it is that you're seeing, you know, out the window kind of approach. You know, if it's there, I paint it. No, you need to ask yourself, hey, what works, what doesn't work? Do I see something that just really stands out like a sore thumb? Well, then you know you're going to want to avoid that one way or shape or form. You're either going to move a tree or change a color, or change a value.
Yeah, I was just thinking when you were saying make it simple and choosing the 3 values. And of course, have always talked about how the past masters don't use a lot of values in their paintings.
Right.
The
generally you'll see about 5 values. Yeah, 5 values.
Yeah.
Is kind of, if you really want to count it up, that's kind of where you're at. My take on it is because there's a lot of complexity going on here when we're painting. And in order to keep a handle on the thinking part versus the creative part, the part where we're just dealing with visual information, it just makes sense to me to just kind of get it into your head, 3 values, light, middle, dark. Now, you can have some variety in there. I wouldn't hold anybody to exactly matching 3 values, just, identical. But so, one area you could say, well, where does this kind of fit in? Does this fit into my light part or my middle part or my dark part? And then paint accordingly.
Right. It does make something simpler.
Exactly.
More simple, whatever.
Yeah.
When you are painting, because you're not sitting here asking yourself every 5 seconds, even if you're out plein air painting, what value is that? Well,
exactly.
It's going to be the value that I basically assign to it. So that's one last thing that I have to worry about. Now I have to worry about my color relationships, my color choices.
And then your color
is
dictated by the choice well, not the choice, but what you were seeing at the very beginning, which is basically where is your light coming from, and is it a warmer light or a cooler light? So right there, we've simplified some of this information. And because your job is not to copy what it is that you're seeing. Your job is to interpret what it is that you're seeing.
Yeah. And a lot of that in that interpretation also comes into what emotionally moved you to make that scene and whatever it is you're painting important to you.
Sure. And, it can be, it can be emotion. It can be just visual elements. I mean, as artists, we can get excited about just color, Oh, look at the shape. Look at the color. Maybe the contrast of values.
And how
it doesn't have to be trite, object-oriented emotional response.
Yes.
It can be an emotional response just to the visual information.
Yes, exactly. I guess would the same hold true then if we're using a photograph, what we were just talking about?
Absolutely. Absolutely. You still need to identify your light source. That's a big thing. You need to use your critical thinking skills to evaluate what's going on in the photograph, or photographs. It's kind of nice to have multiple, photographs.
Yeah.
But you need to ask yourself, is there anything in here that, boy, just doesn't really belong, or it's kind of a, an eyesore, or maybe it would be better if I did this, that, or the other thing. So that helps to identify that information right at the beginning. So you're still dealing with all the same information. It's just a little bit of a different learning curve, and it's just sometimes a little different information. So, here's the thing about painting directly. I think ultimately we get a better understanding of color and value relationships when you're painting directly. On the other hand, if you're using reference material or, your own photographs, I think it's easier to see positive and negative space. It's easier to see a value pattern, generally because the photograph is smaller, than what you're seeing. So we kind of, narrow down that information, and it connects more easily in the brain. Oh yeah, it's small. I can see that pattern more easily. So so the photograph offers that advantage. And then I think the positive and negative space idea, because it's already flattened out 2 dimensions, it makes it easier to see that and to use that as your drawing information. Instead of drawing things, you're creating your value pattern and identifying positive and negative space. So each one of those kind of does different things. That's why I say each one is like a learning curve to be able to use. But, it can, whether you choose, to only paint from life or to paint from life and use photos, You can see where it offers possibilities in appreciating and evaluating what it is that we're seeing in slightly different ways.
Yeah, and they're all tools, and we just have to learn.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly.
Certain
It's only
from
a
those
tool.
tools. I mean, you know.
Yeah, I like to say, the problem with photos is that, too many people just copy photos. So they kind of look like poor copies of photos, or sometimes good copies of photos, but they don't bring anything else to the table. Let's put it that way. If you can't find something else to say about what it is that you're painting, then maybe you need to paint something different. You need to find that information somehow. Not always easy, I mean, some things we can get really excited about and we just, have fun with it and we go for it. And other times it's kind of like, oh, I thought I had a good idea, but what happened to it, kind of thing. So, but you need to find something else to say. So, painting is more akin to, let's say, poetry than it is to essay writing, for example, So you just need to find, poetry, we take the words and we kind of do something different with them than just describe, even though good writing can do that too, but you get the gist of it.
Yeah, absolutely. One of the things that I tend to do with photo reference is use it for drawing reference more than anything else, and possibly to, take a few photographs and create a scene on my sketch pad. Check out the value plan that I want before I. Yeah, pretty much. I mean, when I get to the point where I'm adding color, I already have my value plan laid out, and I'm at the point where I'm adding color. Those photographs disappear because I don't want anything between me and that.
And what you
me
remembered,
and even my ego. I need that to go away. It's like everybody leave the room, and it's just this painting that I'm creating with the color, and and I actually try to put myself back into that place and remember the light. And as you say, some of us have great memories, and some of us don't. But
landscape painting presents some different challenges, and that's why photos can seem so lacking. Obviously, there's subtlety of color, but your big thing there is dimensional space, because the space is usually so vast that it changes up how we're seeing the information. There's a old thing, we've all been there, where you go on a vacation and you take all these pictures and you go, oh yeah, this is so beautiful, and snap pictures of this, snap pictures of that. You get home, you look at your pictures and go, well, that didn't look anything like what I was seeing. I don't remember it like that. Well, the reason is because when your brain looks at something, it's focusing on your area of interest, whatever is important to you. And so you will see it a little differently. So we say that photos lie. Yeah. You say, hey, the brain's not very truthful either, believe me. Photos can have issues, but holy cow, the brain is just as likely to show you information that is not necessarily accurate. Now, does that mean it's bad? No, of course it doesn't. But it's not always accurate, so.
Yeah, it's interesting, because what I tend to look at for direct observation is how, and what I think photographs end up lacking is how light affects the objects.
Right.
So,
and that's a dimensional problem.
I will stand there and just watch light. Yes, absolutely. Yeah.
That's a dimensional problem.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
So that. Go ahead.
Go ahead, Carolyn.
No, I was just going to say, that just gets into that whole spatial thing, that because the space is so much more than, let's say, setting up a model in your studio or doing a still life. It's a spatial problem, so that's a dimensional problem.
Yeah.
And that modifies everything. So then you need to decide, what the heck is it that you can't recreate that. You absolutely can't. It's an impossibility. You've got an object that is 3 dimensions plus time versus a squashed down 2-dimensional object on your canvas. So what you need to do is find something to say about what it is that you're seeing. And to me, it's visual language kind of wins out a lot of the time.
Right. Um, I'm going to ask this one last question, and then we'll get into some questions that our audience has for you. And it kind of, I think, is going to end up summing up most of what we talked about. But basically, what do you see, or if you had a chance of like downloading to all of our brains, what's the basic, most important tools for an artist to understand? This is like before they create their masterpieces. All come together.
Yeah. Well, the more
maybe
we
more
paint,
than one.
Yeah, the more, the whole tool thing kind of, the more we paint, the more we see. And the more tools we add to our tool belt, you kind of learn that, well, this kind of works or that kind of works or whatever. So that's a given. And ultimately that should be a positive thing, but it isn't always a positive thing. Because sometimes the more we see, then maybe we're seeing too much. Then we need to reevaluate perhaps our tools or our concept of what it is that we're painting, So as our abilities increase, so should our expectations. So this whole thing is always, it's changing, it's evolving, it's like life itself. It's not fixed in time. So I think we kind of get caught up too much in that idea that painting is something to be mastered. It's a craft, and you just get good at it. And by golly, once you get good at it, you just make beautiful paintings forever and ever. And I absolutely don't agree with that, because that could be one of our biggest myths, is that this is all about skill and something you can absolutely learn, and there's an end result to that learning. So if we expect that this is basically just a craft to be mastered, after long and arduous study, then where does that lead you? It's like, okay, you just crank out another picture. Somewhere along the line, as we evolve in our painting skills, how we see the world changes, and when that happens, then the whole process just keeps changing. It's just evolving. There's a series of books that were put out, and it was called The Impressionists by Themselves, and it was basically because all those guys wrote letters, and so a lot of this series was based on these letters that went back and forth among the different artists. And in there, and this is a quote I use sometimes in workshops, Monet wrote, I'm hard at it, working stubbornly on a series of different effects, grain stacks, and of course we can probably all draw a visual on that one. But at this time of year, the sun sets so fast that it's impossible to keep up with it. I'm getting so slow at my work, it makes me despair. But the further I get, the more I see that a lot of work has to be done in order to render what I'm looking for. Instantaneity, the envelope, above all, the same light spread over everything. And more than ever, I'm disgusted by easy things that come in one go. So he may have acquired tools, but his vision changed. And as his vision of what he wanted to accomplish changed, then maybe the tools weren't adequate enough, or they needed to change. So here again, a lot of people like to say, boy, give me a set of rules. Tell me how to do this. There must be some kind of secret. No, it's like life. We never really know what's around the corner, but we do know that it's going to change.
Yeah. Yeah.
Maybe not the answer you wanted.
That's the fun to me. No, well, yes and no. You're always constantly challenging yourself, or you should be. And if you can just crank them out one right after the other, are you really creating?
Well, exactly.
If they all
and
look the same for all the same formula. No, I'm not saying there is. I actually, yeah.
Yeah. You
can
make pictures, so that's fine.
Mm-hmm.
But maybe you want to make paintings, and then that's something else.
Yeah. So, and I think that's an individual choice, naturally.
Right. Exactly.
And what folks are looking for. And I'm not, and definitely don't take that as something as being wrong. I didn't mean to have that in there at all.
I don't mean it that way.
Yeah, absolutely. It's really interesting too, because when you were talking, I was thinking back to some of the students that I have, and I'm very, very conscious and trying not to change something that may be part of their style, like color choices. It may not be a color choice that I would make, but if it fits and they like it and there's nothing that I could technically see as wrong, why not?
Oh, exactly.
Maybe it's the way they see. Yeah. So.
Yeah, exactly. We all see things slightly differently. So.
Right.
So, the idea of replicating, just trying to copy the information, throw that one out the window, because we all have a different version of reality. I mean, it's kind of close. Let's face up to that one, but it's not exactly the same. And so we can see colors a little differently. Colors have different impacts. Some of us like certain colors, and some of us don't like those same colors, for example, So we have personal preferences. We have, our own experience changes how we see information. So yeah, that's it. There's no one way to do this. That's for sure.
Right. Okay. So I thank you for all of your insight and observations and talking with us for the last hour. I'm going to step aside now and let Sarah, hopefully you have questions, Sarah, after I said that from the audience.
I do have
to ask Carolyn. Great. Take it away.
Here, and I wanted to let you guys know, if you have a question, type it in the question section, and we'll get to as many of these as we can. Okay, first things first, Carolyn. Dina asks, are these examples oil or acrylic?
They're all oil.
Okay.
All oil, yeah.
And let's see here. Okay, Donna asks, I would like to know if one form needs to be more realistic just to clarify the subject matter of the painting.
One form, was that the word?
Yeah.
One form needs to be more realistic. I wouldn't say yes or no to that one. I would say that it kind of comes down to, does it work? Does it look visually interesting to you? Does it, here's the thing about realism. We kind of already set up some parameters for ourselves in the sense that, yeah, by golly, it's kind of it has to look like something, right? I mean, realist painters, that's what we have to do. So working within those parameters of it kind of has to look like something, then you have to make decisions based on, well, does that kind of look like something? I always say you can use all that visual information to make something interesting, but at some point you need to stop, look at your painting and say, well, geez, does that look like a nose? So there's always that element there. And then you always want areas of your painting where your eye is going to be some area of the painting that's going to hold the interest a little bit more than elsewhere. Otherwise, you're just zipping around the painting, Nothing's going to hold your attention. You look at it and you go, whoa, that's interesting. Instead of, kind of, oh, yeah, you need that kind of sense of, oh, this is what I'm looking at. So, but, there's always possibilities in that range of how much more information, how much more distinct, how much more hard-edged, how much, there's a lot of possibilities in that.
Okay, thank you. Laura asks, I have done a little painting. I am just a beginner. I draw using graphite. Do you normally just get out your brushes and paint, or do you have an outline of your drawing?
No, I always just start painting. I'm not one to, it depends, obviously if you're doing some elaborate big composition, then you need some better information to start with, okay? So, that kind of helps there. But this is a comfort level. I finally, at some point along the whole painting process, I finally realized that my initial marks on the canvas that I made needed only for me at that point to be in the ballpark. They didn't need to be exact, because at that point of my painting career, believe me, I had corrected enough paintings where you look at it and go, whoa, that's off. So I realized that correcting was not a big issue, that, you know, hopefully most of the time I could identify that information that was off and fix it. So as I became more comfortable with that idea, then I became more comfortable with just grabbing a brush and just starting to make some marks on the canvas. But if you are not as comfortable with your drawing, you know, at an early stage in your career or whenever, then you need to have more marks and they need to be a little bit more controlled. What I would caution people on with that approach is to not outline everything. So think about your painting more like a beautiful drawing, in the sense that you're using the lighter or middle value of your canvas as something, and you're making marks not over everything, but just enough to define the form, start making your placement, devising your composition, you know, et cetera, et cetera. So in other words, don't outline everything. That's my advice.
Great, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Let's see. Somebody, Gloria wants to know, what size are the paintings shown on the screen?
They vary. I think we're going anywhere from like 9 by 12 to maybe 16 by 20. Not really big. I don't work super big, so you know, 20 by 30 is usually somewhere in that range, is about the largest I work.
Great, thank you. Ernest asks, how do you approach what you do with the background?
Try not to think of it as the background, because that's a verbal thing that trips our brains up. So in other words, we have object and we have background. Ultimately, what you have is a canvas with visual information, and that canvas is to become something else. Okay, I mean, that's to become your painting, if you will. With that in mind, all that information that goes on that canvas is about how it relates. And once you set up that little barrier, that little verbal barrier, which is, by golly, here's my head, for example, and here's the background, then it presents other issues. So, but it still comes down to, you know, sometimes we just go there, we can't help it. It's like, oh, gee, I got this great head. Now what do I do with the rest of the painting, you know? So think verbally. Get rid of that whole idea of background and just say, what do I do with this area of the canvas, if you will? Put a different verbal spin on it. It can make a difference. And then ask yourself, where do you want to lose an edge and where do you want to find an edge? So, for example, if it is a head, and let's say the person has dark hair, and you decide that you want to create an edge on one side of that head and lose the edge on the other side, then what are you going to do? Obviously, you're going to bring a lighter value up on one side and a darker value over on the other side, with some variation, obviously. So where do you want to lose an edge and where do you want to find an edge? And use your values and your colors accordingly.
Thank you. Gloria asks, do you seal your canvas before you paint with any product medium to keep the colors from sinking into the canvas? Do you work on your painting over the course of a few days? If so, do you oil out the canvas?
I use oil primed canvas, so no, I don't seal the canvas with it. I mean, it's already primed canvas.
Okay.
So I'm not using raw canvas. Obviously, you know, there are some technical issues that as artists we need to pay attention to, and that would be one of them. You know, if you choose to use like raw canvas, yeah, you're going to have to seal it with something, because the oil on the paint's not going to do it any favors. Generally, you know, I prefer to work wet and wet. That obviously that doesn't always happen. So then, yes, I will go back in, and I'll usually just thin down some, right now I'm using the walnut oil and alkyd medium by Graham. I just like that one. It doesn't smell obnoxiously. It works good. So I'll thin some of that down, and I'll use that to, you know, wet the canvas back a little bit. Okay. But I don't generally use a lot of medium, and that's one thing that I caution students on when they are starting a painting, and I think that's why a lot of people are more comfortable with drawing everything in first and then going back to paint, because a lot of people have the idea that you have to start wet and thick. And I tell people, start your painting thin and dry. Think of it more like a charcoal drawing. And the reason being is you can add paint. You can always add paint. You can always make it thicker and juicier if that's what you want to do. But once you start too wet and too thick, you have a hard time modifying your information. And what if you decide you're going to change something, So start thin and dry, and it's a little bit more of a comfort zone when you begin your painting.
Okay, great, thank you. Sue asks, could you discuss depth of field?
I'm not quite sure where she's going with that one. I'm
not sure either.
So I'll just throw out some information, see if we kind of hit the mark. Okay. In my mind, this gets down to the whole idea of you're viewing something that is three-dimensional, 4 if you want to consider time, but three-dimensional, and you're squashing it down into 2 dimensions. So you're flattening that image out. So what it comes down to is what's important with your painting. I like to say that if you really go and analyze a lot of paintings, what you're going to see is that some information is fairly flat, actually. It's painted more 2-dimensionally, and some information will be more dimensional. And you can, look at historical paintings and kind of see some of this, especially going back with the Impressionist work, perhaps draw up an image in your head of Degas or, some of those guys. So you've got some 2-dimensional information, some 3-dimensional information. And they're using that dimensional information to kind of direct your eye around the painting, if you will, or things that have more interest, perhaps a little more dimensional than other things. So edges have a lot to do with that because, as we well know, what we focus on is more hard-edged. The nearer it is to us, then the further away it starts getting fuzzier, right? So that makes sense. But a lot of it depends on what you're painting about. What is it, a still life? Then what's most important about your painting? That's probably going to be generally more hard-edged than everywhere else in the painting. Is it a landscape? Then where in the landscape are you looking? But keep in mind that you still need to suggest that dimensional change somehow, and it's going to be, value, color, and edges. I don't know if that answered your question, but that's where my brain went.
I think so. If not, Sue can ask another one.
Okay.
Okay, so Gloria asks, this is a little confusing to me at the beginning, but I'll just read it as it is. She says, please describe your method of type of paint mixed with what type of medium or dryer to get the beautiful effect of texture of canvas showing through the thick brush strokes. Do you ever thin the paint with turpentine when laying out the painting? So I think basically what she's asking is, how do you get this look of the thick brush stroke?
Right, yeah. What kind of paint you use really, well, the paint, the brushes, and the canvas, okay? And all 3 of those things are somewhat dependent on how you like to paint, for example. So for someone who likes a smoother application of paint, more even application of paint, they probably wouldn't be using the same canvas that I am, nor the same brushes. I mean, it comes down to personal preference. What I use, I usually use like a Clausen 66 canvas, which is, a little toothy, but not overly obnoxious. But if you put the paint on thinly, you're going to get those skips. And sometimes I leave them alone, if it doesn't bother me and I get the painting to a point where it kind of works, I really don't care if I have canvas showing, because to me the other information is more important. I know that if I go back in and methodically fill in all those little things, it's going to change the painting. So the texture of the canvas has something to do with that. And then your paint, because different kinds of paint have different consistencies. We all know that, some colors can be stiffer than other colors, and some can be kind of runny, and that's why a lot of people use medium, is because they have to get some brush flow. So I've pretty much over the years, just by default stuck with Holbein paints because they generally have about the same consistency from color to color to color on my palette. So they're all, they all are somewhat creamy. So when I start out, and I can, if I need to, I'll thin down a little bit with Gamsol, when I'm starting a painting, and that's basically, thin the paint just a little bit, get a little brush flow, just enough so you can make a stroke, and a lot of it depends on what kind of stroke you're making. And then as the painting evolves, I don't always use medium, but if I do use medium, then I'm using that, generally that walnut oil alkyd combination.
Okay, cool. Thank you. Allison, I like this question, maybe because I can relate. What do you normally tell new artists who hit the "this looks like garbage" point in their paintings? I have yet to find a way to bridge that mental hurdle, and it gets a bit daunting.
If you can, the ideal way to handle that one is for at least a little while, quit looking at your art books and try and get a hold of some like really bad paintings to look at. So then maybe you can pat yourself on the back and say, boy, I'm not this bad, which sounds kind of tacky, but whatever it takes sometimes. Here's the thing that I see. All of us probably have, shelves of books or art magazines or something because we like looking at that visual information. It's an inspiration. Sometimes we have that information because we want to learn how to, it's like kind of like, well, how did they do that? What the heck did they do there? Mm-hmm. So it can get a little daunting, I mean, if you're always surrounded mm-hmm. by, let's say, books on some of the great painters ever, and this is all you're looking at, you're going to go, boy, this stuff that I'm doing just doesn't. So at some point, you need to kind of, weigh that with a grain of salt, put some of that stuff away, and just say that, no, this is your painting. It's not someone else's painting. Yes, that painting was interesting and you liked it, but maybe you need to reevaluate some of that and try and decide what it is that you really like. It's not just that it's a good mm-hmm. painting. What about that painting do you like? Is it the contrast? Is it the color? Is it the edges? In other words, pick a smaller area to focus on instead of just, by golly, I can't make a good painting. No, pick something little, Pick something that maybe in that painting you can get a handle on and work on that.
Good advice. Thank you. Okay. I like this question a lot too. Dee asks, do children see all the colors in things, or do you need to train them to look? In other words, does the brain not allow even the child to see all the colors?
Well, it's kind of interesting, isn't it? Because what's some of the early information that you share with a child?
Here,
what color is this? What color is this?
Red,
blue. What was that? I missed that.
I said, here are your 8 crayons.
Sarah said, here are your
8. Ruined it for everyone.
So early on, sure, kids start, but they're kind of taught that, aren't they? And then as mm-hmm. their language develops, then probably able to put, color perception. But that's really kind of an interesting question because that goes to, do all people in the world see color the same? Or are there any variations? So that kind of goes to the whole kid thing. And here's the thing, and believe it or not, there's throughout history there's been some disagreement over this. Part of it comes down to what I think they've determined is that yes, people have the capability to see all, myriad different colors, and we kind of see them in the same way. But our language has something to do with how we notice and how we identify color. So people in different cultures with different languages can have, they can break, let's say, blue down into, different kinds of blue, for example, than perhaps someone else might. So the language has an impact on that. So when I say, red apple, and that's how kids learn to see, oh, this is a red apple, it kind of goes to the line that perhaps we don't see all the variation in the color. But if you look, you'll see it. I mean, we all have the capability biologically, to see the different color. Mm-hmm. So I would say with kids, it's a learning process. But yeah, we start them out early. What color is this?
Mhm. I have to say, just since I've been working here, I see way more colors just in everything that I never noticed before, and it's really cool.
It is fun. Yeah,
to develop that like artist eye, and I'm really grateful for it because it's just amazing. Just looking outside right now, I see like trees that are so many different shades of green, but before I would have just been like, oh, that's green.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Right.
So it's
Right.
definitely something I think you have to relearn for sure. Cool.
And it develops over time too.
Right. Okay. You mentioned a book earlier in the presentation, like when you were chatting with Linda. I don't remember the context of it, but a few people were asking if you could say the title and author of that again.
Vision and Art, The Biology of Seeing by Margaret Livingstone. It's an interesting book. Some people are a little put off. I mean, there's science in there, obviously, but here's the thing about this book. What I tell my students is you don't have to read it all, and it's a large format book, and it has lots of graphics and lots of pictures. But she makes some really interesting observations, not only about how we see, the science of seeing, but also makes some connections with viewing art that I think a lot of artists could find interesting. So that's it's just an overview on that whole idea, the science of seeing and how that affects us and what impact that has on art and on painting. And then, another book that I'd like to mention, because I find a lot of students don't have a lot of them just don't have enough grasp on art history. So I'm going to throw this one out there. And out of all the art history books I have on my library shelf, this is the one that I'll grab, and it's called The Annotated Mona Lisa by Carol Strickland. And this is like a condensed version of art history.
Okay, thank you. Hopefully everyone got those or got a chance to write those names down. Well, somebody asked Margaret who again?
Livingstone.
Livingstone, okay.
Yeah, but I think, if you just Vision and Art, The Biology of Seeing, you'll find the book.
Okay, cool. And then earlier when you guys were talking about brain games, a few people sent links. It looks like there might be full episodes on National Geographic's website. So I just wanted to pass that on. Is that show hosted by Jason Silva?
I'm not sure, but I think there's only one Brain Games that's on there.
Okay.
So, yeah.
I'm not sure. I just follow, he does some cool YouTube videos, and a lot of them are about, the stuff you were talking about. They're shorter, though. And I feel like he is the host of that show, but I haven't seen
Okay. Yeah. And keep in mind that in the Brain Games, there's different aspects, and people can look for the ones that they feel will be, because there's a good one on color, for example. There's a good one on, the whole seeing thing and how we don't necessarily see what we think we see. So, people can just tune into the ones that they think will pertain to them more.
Yeah, I really hope they're online. I want to check those out.
Sarah?
Sure. Yes.
Sarah, according to Wikipedia, it is Jason Silva.
Okay.
I just Googled.
He's very interesting. He's kind of hyper in his approach on YouTube, but he does these 2-minute shots of awe videos that I really enjoy, and a lot of them are about art and creativity and how we express ourselves and how we see things. So if you're interested in that, I find it very inspiring, and I think he's just super interesting.
Okay, so it was Jason Silva?
Yeah, Jason Silva.
Okay.
Yes.
Yeah, but he can be a little bit, I guess,
if you Google him,
but he's really cool.
If you Google him, Carolyn, his YouTube stuff is the first link when you Google.
Yeah, I definitely recommend everyone check him out. Okay, so we have quite a few other things. People are looking for more information on you, Carolyn. Donna says, this is so incredibly freeing. Are you on Facebook?
No, I'm not on Facebook. If I had a husband that could do it for me, because I know there's a lot of men painters out there whose wives help them with that thing, So if I had someone else that would kind of handle that, that would be a good thing. But no, it's sad to say I'm not on Facebook.
Okay. Well, the more and more Facebook gets crazy, the more and more not being on there appeals to me. I love it, though.
There should be a better way of. I had a friend of mine the other day send me a link to an artist who I know in his blog, and I was really taken aback by the fact that he actually had a blog. So I texted her back and said, "Does everybody have a blog? which I'm beginning to think is maybe something I need to do. So I don't know. We'll contemplate that.
So do you have a website or anything where people can see more of your art?
Oh, I certainly have a website, just CarolynAnderson.com. So.
Okay, great. And then somebody else was asking if you have or are planning on any type of instructional DVDs or books.
No DVDs. I probably will not do that, but I am contemplating some kind of book. But it will probably not necessarily be some kind of how-to book, because I think over my career I've narrowed my focus down to pretty much the whole brain thing and understanding, trying to understand how we see, what we see, how that impacts what we paint, why is painting important, all those kinds of things, which kind of leads me a little bit away from the technical how-to stuff, which I'm always nervous to get too involved in, because then again, people tend to take things as rules instead of just suggestions. So even though, like in my workshops, I do demonstrations, we talk about some technical things, but boy, I don't know that it would ever be a how-to, but yeah, I might do a book.
Okay, well, great. Well, I think we got to most of the questions. I just want to remind everyone that we did record this, so I know a few of you joined us a little bit late, and I will be putting this recording up on our Artist Network YouTube page, and then it will also be on Linda's page on Artist Network, which is artistnetwork.com/art-chat. And let's see, you can see the little thank you slide I have up now, which has a coupon code for everyone who joined us today. And you can use that at northlightshop.com. It's ArtChats10. And then I wanted to let everyone know that Linda has a few courses coming up at Artist Network University, her next one being Getting Started with Oil Painting, which starts on Tuesday. So if you want to join Linda for that, feel free to use the coupon code ANU10OFF, and that's at artistnetworkuniversity.com. And you can also see some upcoming courses with her there as well. And then, like I said, you'll be able to find the recording on artistnetwork.com/art-chat, and I will try and get that up later today. So this was very, very interesting. Thank you so much, you guys.
Thank you.
I really appreciate it.
Yes, thank you, Carolyn. And
go ahead.
I think that was
I was just going to give Charo. Yeah, that was me. Sorry. I was just going to give Carolyn an opportunity to tell us if she has any workshops coming up or any exhibits that we can go see.
Well, not a full-scale exhibit type thing, but the American Impressionist show will be this fall in Denver. Probably looking at a workshop in Fredericksburg, Texas in February, and then in April I'll be at the Plein Air Convention in Monterey, and then one of my favorite places ever, New Harmony, Indiana, and I'm going to teach a workshop there along with C.W. Mundy, Laura Robb, Scott Christensen, and Dan Gerhardt, so a good time will be had by all.
And that's real close to me.
Oh,
so,
okay, there you go.
Hopefully I'll see.
New Harmony, Indiana.
Yeah.
So, and then I would encourage, and you probably still have that available for anybody who wants more information on edges, to check out our previous talk on edges. I know that's one
Mastering
thing
Edges.
Where can they find that, Linda?
If they go to my website, which is Linda Fisler, FISLER.com, and go to Art Chat Library, there's all of the old art chats that we did when I was part of AMO or when we were doing it as AMO. All of them are listed there, and I also share ours that we do here as well.
Okay, great. Yeah,
so
you guys can go there for all of the previous art chats. I definitely recommend you check those out. All right, well, we're getting a lot of thank yous and appreciation coming through. So I guess on behalf of all of the attendees, I want to thank you, Carolyn, and of course you, Linda. And I guess we can go ahead and wrap this up. I hope you guys have a good rest of your day. And Linda, oh, you know what, real quick, do you want to talk about what's coming up for the next art chat?
Sure. September seems to be like the travel season for all of the artists that I was trying to set up for a art chat. So we may not have one in September.
Okay.
I'm still working on it. That's not like, set in stone. I'm still working and talking with folks, but we do have two that we will have scheduled in October. The first one will be with Joseph McEarl, and Joe does not use any photo graphic reference at all. He uses his plein air studies and his terrific memory. And then, so that we'll be talking about some elements of nature and things like that with Joe. And then about in the middle of the month, I think it's like the October 16th, we'll be talking with George Gallo. And Sarah and I will be probably talking a little bit offline about this particular thing because George Gallo's book will be launching at that time. And so we'll talk about his book, and we'll also talk about some different observations. And then in November, we'll be talking with Lori Putnam, and I have not set up with Lori yet exactly what we're going to be talking about, but that'll be another very popular chat, I'm sure.
Okay, great. Yeah, thanks for sharing that, and we hope you guys will join us for those. Keep an eye out for emails from Artist Network, or just visit artistnetwork.com/art-chats and follow Linda on Facebook. That's a really good way to stay up to date. So thanks again, everyone, for joining us, and have a great weekend. We'll talk to you all soon. Bye.
Thanks, Sarah. Thanks, Linda.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone.